Well, it's a new year. Today is January 9th. The new CPUs are launching from Team Red. These have been some of the most hotly anticipated... Wait. Oh, no. Not those. Well, hey, Team Red's launching some new CPUs, and they are hotly anticipated. But they're not the ones that are most hotly anticipated. Let me explain. Alright, today AMD is launching Ryzen 5, 7, and 9 CPUs. They're the non-X CPUs. And they're going to be costing quite a bit less than the regular with X CPUs. Or at least their debut price is quite a bit less. Street price, that's another thing, we'll talk about that. But the 7900, 12 core, no X. 7700, no X. 8 core. And the 7600, 6 core, no X. Those are launching today. There's a lot to talk about here. This isn't the first time that AMD has done this. Remember the 5900 non-X? That was basically an OEM-only part. I briefly entertained trying to get my hands on one. Ultimately, I didn't get my hands on a 5900 non-X, but they did show up in OEM systems. OEM meaning that like a pre-built system from HP or Dell or somebody like that. And people were basically happy with them. I mean, a 12 core and a workstation works pretty well. There were people that were working on low power builds looking specifically for that 5900. People that were looking to build in things like our Dr. Zaber Sentry. Love this thing, love the look of this thing, it's just so cool. The problem is that the new 7900X CPUs, well, I mean, AMD's bumped up the wattage because this is a fiercely competitive CPU market, and when you're doing small form factor builds like this, cooling can be a little bit of a challenge. Well, good news, these are 65 watt TDP, thermal design power, 88 watt socket power CPUs that are designed for low power applications. But they're still overclockable, and you can still overclock them to the point that they need liquid cooling. So if you want to just get a non-X CPU, save a few bucks, and get close to X performance, you can. Let's take a look at the lineup. Now on the box, the specifications for these three are 7900, 5.4 gigahertz, 12 cores, 76 megs of cache, a 65 watt TDP. What's not an AMD slot is the base clock. The base clock for all of these is around between 700 megahertz and 1 gigahertz slower for that base clock. But the boost clocks are actually pretty respectable. I mean, 5.4 gigahertz for a 65 watt quote unquote TDP CPU, that's actually not bad. AMD says that these CPUs kind of slot in with the non-K CPUs in terms of like a comparison. So if you wanted to compare the 7900 to like the 13900 non-K, that would be an okay comparison. But the things on the Intel side are a little bit more nuanced. We'll talk about that in a second. The 7700, 5.3 gigahertz max boost, 5.1 gigahertz for the 7600. $229 for the 7600 is priced pretty aggressively considering the 7600X's debut price was $299. The problem is street prices. If we just go to Amazon and we look at the 7900X and the 7700X and the 7600X, those street prices are quite a bit lower than the launch prices with these CPUs. Really, a lot of the pricing and fierce competition overshadows a lot of what's going on with these CPUs, assuming that they have the goods, which we'll talk about in a second. But the pricing is the thing that everybody immediately wants to jump to. In a best case scenario, you buy these CPUs without there's no X, you save a few bucks and you basically get the same performance. You also get a box cooler, so your system is going to cost less. For the 7700 and the 7900, you get the ye olde Wraith Prism. Look at that. We maybe have a slightly different thermal paste pattern. My other ones were a little thicker and they came with just a square pattern instead of this hex pattern, but okay, cool. Solid copper, base plate, 4 heat pipes. Looks like AMD's tried and true design. Looks pretty much the same as last generation. Really close to it. If they've made a change, it's a subtle change in the cooler, and this is what you get for the 7900 and the 7700. Truthfully, I'm a little surprised that the 7700 also comes in at 65 watts. Before testing, I didn't think that would bode well in terms of chiplet performance. Like how poorly bend are these CPUs, the chiplets, these 6 cores, that they didn't make sense to use somewhere else, but I was pleasantly surprised. Our 7600, its cooler on the other hand is the comparatively more modest Wraith stealth. There's really not much to this CPU cooler at all. This is equivalent to maybe a $25-ish CPU cooler. It's about $25 for an equivalent CPU cooler at somewhere like Micro Center. So if you want to move up, you're going to be spending, $40-ish on a CPU cooler. Of course, it's AM5. It's backward compatible with AM4. The market is flooded with used AM4 tower coolers and everything else. You may be able to build something around that. Other than the lower clock frequencies and lower power usage out of the box, there's not really a lot of changes to write home about. These are AM5. Lower cost AM5 motherboards are in vogue. I tried to get my hands on the ASRock Riptide motherboard. This is a $170 AM5 motherboard where they have cut the features to the bone for this. But it's a $170 AM5 motherboard. I thought that would be interesting to take a look at, especially with the 12 core. I couldn't get my hands on that. So I ended up using the X670E Tai Chi for this review and just sort of rotating the CPUs around. I think if budget is a factor, you're going to want to look at lower cost AM5 motherboards, which are certainly an option now, much more so than they were on platform launch. Now let's call a spade or a potato, or a non-X. I mean, there's at least 50% less X's in the product title. That can't be good, right? Let's start with the 7600. I'll be honest, the 7600X, when it launched, wasn't really super compelling. I mean, in a nutshell, AM5 is a premium platform. DDR5 is premium. PCIe 5 is premium. The motherboards that launched were premium. $300 for a 6-core, even if they're the 6 really nice cores, it's kind of a premium price for a premium product on a premium platform. A little high in the market competition, everything else. There are a lot of economic factors that are weighing on this in terms of cost adjustments, because we've seen costs actually go up of other parts that have been out over a year. If you check, price history. For example, the i5-12400, one of my favorite processors from last generation, because I got it for $100. You can't get it for less than $2 now. That's just the economic situation that we find ourselves in. So the 7600, even with its really modest included cooler, it's pretty good. It's a powerhouse. The problem is that the price of the 7600X has come down. And yeah, if you really want to do price parity to price parity, you have to include the 7600X plus cost of cooler versus the 7600 non-X, and then the price delta looks a little different. That'll be the pattern for all the processors when we talk about them. It's like, yeah, you're going to need some cooling, but the reality is that you could probably use a box of paper clips as a heatsink. Disclaimer, don't actually do that with the 7600 because it doesn't use that much power. I don't think the 7600 is a good buy for actual workstation use though, because the cost delta to go to the 7700, when you look at the whole cost of the system, would be a much better choice. For the 7700 processor, and you look at gaming performance and everything else, there's really not a huge difference between 7600 and 7700 in gaming titles in general, unless we're talking about 1080p. But I think talking about 1080p with the highest end GPUs is misleading with these, and we'll talk about that in the gaming section. But the 7700 I think is the better buy because it is a negligible cost increase when you look at the cost for the overall system. If you're a college student majoring in computer science and you want to dabble with virtual machines, whether you run Windows or Linux as your primary operating system, the 7700 makes a pretty good choice. You can get reasonable gaming. Our Phantom Gaming, our $300-ish, this is a 6650 Phantom Gaming from ASRock. This is, you would be hard-pressed to be a college student and be unhappy with a GPU like this. You don't need to spend $1,400 or $1,700 on a GPU. I don't care if you're doing fancy, crazy machine learning stuff. Go to somebody in the computer science lab and get time on a remote machine if you really, really want to do that. But the 6650 for 1080p and 1440p gaming, even high frame rate gaming, it holds its own. It really does well. And the 7700 just gives you 8 pretty high performance cores, even without the X, even without the ridiculous boost clock, even though the base clock is lowered. Overall, the performance is still pretty similar. If you do want to add an aftermarket cooler and get the overclock, you totally can. But then if you're processor plus cooler versus processor plus cooler, and it's like $20 more to just get the X processor, you should just get the X processor. Again, make no mistake, these non-X processors are aimed at the volume market, like the 5800 was, like I was mentioning before, and these are the CPUs that AMD is going to move in volume. They're just also releasing them to enthusiasts in the DIY market. And yeah, you can pick this up. I mean, if I were building a system for somebody that came to me and said, hey, I want to build this for a college student, I really would be attracted to I could just buy the processor. I don't have to think about a cooler, just slap it in, good to go. The Wraith cooler is, as far as bundled coolers go, one of the best. So yeah, it works really well. If you look at temperatures, this temperature story starts to get interesting here because, you know, where the box of paper clips might work okay for the 7600, we do start to see temperatures creep into the 80s when we're running artificial benchmarks on CPUs like the 7700. Stepping it up to the 7900, it's my personal favorite in this generation. If I were building a powerful workstation, maybe for that third-year computer science student or a grad student, I'd probably opt for the 7900. Bundled cooler works fine, not for overclocking, but bundled cooler works fine. And I'm happy to report that for both the 7700 and the 7900, in those gaming benchmarks, again, there's not really a lot of performance loss if you do put a better cooler on it. So if you just leave everything, the processor at stock, and use an aftermarket cooler, you will get 1 to 3% better performance in games, especially the 1% lows. That's maybe another story, another conversation. But for game performance, just changing the cooler to something better for the 7700 and especially the 7900, you will get slightly better gaming performance. So, okay, that's an option. If you overclock the 7900, it's going to be within spitting distance of the 7900X. But you know, you're throwing away the cooler that comes in the box. I don't really recommend that. The price of the 7900X has also come down. Like, the whole street price thing factors in here pretty heavily, I think, with the 7900 versus 7900X, because there's really not a huge difference in cost, especially when you take into account the overall system cost, because, well, the processor is going to be a little bit more expensive. At the time that I'm shooting this video, it's about $430 for the 7900X, and the launch price of the 7900 is really close to that. And so it's sort of like, now for OEMs like Dell, HP, etc., I'm sure they're paying way, way less for these, and so we may see pre-built systems that seem impossibly cheap because they're getting a deal, and you know, that's okay. The bottom line here with all three of these CPUs is that AMD is really flexing their power efficiency here, and they sort of show that in the benchmarks. When you're doing the comparison with the 13900 non-K versus the 7900, or if you're doing the comparison between the i7, you know, the 13700K versus the 7700, AMD really comes out on top in both performance and power efficiency as long as you stay within the default power limits of those Intel processors. Intel can kind of cheat a little bit though, even though those are not K, they're not overclockable processors. If you put those processors in a motherboard that will give them unlimited power, they will turbo forever, and that changes the performance equation. The single thread performance can turbo for longer, and you will get better gaming performance from the competition from Intel for comparison at certain resolutions. And that's where things get interesting. Let's talk about the gaming benchmarks. Now, even though the 1080p thing is kind of a thing at lower visual fidelity settings, on high and highest settings, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. So here's the breakdown between the 7900X and the 7900 with both the 4090 and the 7900 XTX GPU. All these 7900s is going to get a little confusing. Just look at the graph. The graph will make sense. So 265 versus 272. Okay, yeah, that's 1080p. But the surprising thing here was that this also follows and is even a little bit more exaggerated at 4K. This is repeatable. I'm not sure if this is something down to the drivers or a bug or something. I suspect this will get fixed, but maybe not. Maybe not 100%. Maybe it matters for the way that this particular game loads things. Although I did see a little bit of this in some of the other benchmarks. So while not universally true, generally in gaming benchmarks you'll see that the difference between X and non-X, not much, and usually it's at the lower resolutions that have to do with the higher frame rate and nothing to do with visual fidelity or anything else. So for gaming performance, there's really not a lot of difference between the X and the non-X CPUs, generally. So for a game like Horizon Zero Dawn at 4K with our 7900 XTX, not really a lot of difference. when you go with the X or not the X. A little bit of a difference in 1440p and a bigger difference in 1080p. If you just look closely at the 7900 XTX with the 7900X for comparison and our 3 new non-X CPUs, you'll see that the performance is basically functionally identical, all the way down to even a pluggy little 6-core, which I'm actually really excited about building a home server based around the 6-core, assuming I can find the appropriate motherboard. There's a thread on the Level 1 forum if you want to engage there and suggest motherboards that I might acquire for sort of the ultimate low-power home server. I'm thinking micro ATX because you can actually save a lot of power that way, but it's a story for another time. Back to the games. I thought it might be good to test other kinds of stuff that you might run into for the CPUs, things like Civ turn time. Okay, yes, the Civ turn time, it's a tiny little bit better on the X CPUs versus the non-X, but 6.95 versus 7.0 something, it's functionally the same. If we talk about productivity performance between the X and the non-X counterparts, yes, the productivity and the multi-core scores are going to be a little bit worse. When you're running just a few cores, especially just a few cores of a whole bunch of cores that are available on your CPU, the fact that the CPU is more power limited than their X counterparts doesn't really matter. The boost clock is there because there's not a lot of cores being used. Okay, it's close, not quite the same, and you can overclock and all that kind of stuff, but productivity is where it suffers. Now, you can overclock, again, with the better cooling, but for things like Blender, the breakdown here is pretty interesting. Cinebench, R23, single thread, and multi-thread, scores line up about where you'd expect. No surprises here, really. This is pretty vanilla. It's a lot of words for me to just tell you. It's about how you'd expect it to be with these based and boost clocks, except that you really don't give up very much performance at all in just about all these common scenarios. How about thermals? People were freaking out about this thing is designed to run at 95 degrees C for all time. Well, the thermals here are much better, as you might expect. About 80, 85 degrees C in the worst case scenario. Under normal gaming scenarios, you don't even see that. And again, box of paper clips as a heatsink for the 7600, don't do it. It would be fine. All in all, I was kind of surprised. Deus Ex seemed like it had a worse resolution bottleneck than Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Maybe Shadow of the Tomb Raider has been optimized since I really sort of took a look at this. But you could really see that the non-X CPUs were struggling a little bit more than their X counterparts, probably because of these slightly lower boost clocks, or maybe because Deus Ex will run really well on a lot of CPUs. I'm not really sure what to make of that, if I'm being honest, but something to be aware of. And again, 7900 XTX or 4090, not an amazing choice for a pairing. I mean, to be clear, the 4090 is bottlenecked by the highest end desktop CPUs that you can get in some games in some low resolution scenarios. So don't do it. Doesn't make sense. But with these kind of results, you can see why I think like the 7700 and the 7900 are potential productivity monsters, especially when the price comes down even a little bit more. Because right now, the price being so close to the 7900X, even though I know you got to factor in the coolers, just maybe it's a supply and demand thing, maybe it's an economic pressure thing, maybe it's the fact that toilet paper costs as much as it does right now in Q1 2023. I don't know, but that's just the way it is. I really am excited for all of the off-label use cases for these non-X CPUs. I gotta build another forbidden router. All right. Now, this is something that I really want to call attention to. If you want to be misleading with the gaming performance reviews, you would look at the lower resolutions. And misleading is maybe even too strong of a word. If you are buying a 4090 to pair with these GPUs, it doesn't make sense because these CPUs can't feed a 4090 at resolutions like 1080p. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is our standby for looking at this, and it's one of the reasons that I kind of included because we sort of know all the geometry of how that game behaves. In order for the processor to render a frame and get it out the door onto your monitor, basically, it's this round trip time of CPU touches memory, CPU touches PCIe bus, GPU does its thing, then everything is, displayed on the monitor. And that's really a function of clock speed and memory latency. Now, our floor for memory latency is about 62, 63 nanoseconds. And for this testing, I was using really high performance DDR5 memory. Maybe something a little bit more expensive than what you would put in a system like this just to do the comparison. And so with the really high speed memory and the ridiculous 4090, you're not going to achieve 300 FPS in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. In fact, if you look at a lot of the titles, it really does look like there's some sort of weird CPU bottleneck going on. And spoiler alert, there is a weird CPU bottleneck. But it's not because the CPU itself is 100% pegged. It's because that whole round trip time, the latency involved with everything touching everything else, means that there's a finite, limited number of frames per second that you can service on that platform. But the CPU still has room to be doing other things. Like the CPU could juggle that whole round trip memory bus circle along with computation. The CPU is not actually pegged and so busy it can't do anything else in the traditional sense. A lot of other stuff could be running on in the background. You generally see 1% lows that are much, much, much worse in this situation, where you ask the CPU to do as many frames per second as it possibly can, and it's sort of overwhelmed. The GPU is basically sitting idle, and to be sure, the 4090 is sitting idle. And this is at 1080p, but if we step up to 1440p and 4K, for those resolutions, there's functionally no difference in performance in these CPUs in real-world scenarios. When we're talking about our plucky little 6650, there's functionally no difference between the X and the non-X CPUs. It's maybe 1 to 5% in real-world scenarios, even with 1080p gaming on a GPU like this. And you might say, well, you're giving it less GPU overhead, it's going to be lower frame rate, it's going to be more GPU limited than CPU limited in that scenario. And that's true, that's completely true. But there is a subtlety and a nuance when we say CPU limited, in that the CPU is not actually fully busy. It's fully busy servicing that round trip, but the CPU's also got some capacity to do other things. It's like cargo capacity versus how quickly it can complete the round trip. We've got lots of cargo capacity, it just can't complete the round trip in as short a time as, say, the 7950X with its insanely high clock speed and DDR5 and PCIe 5 and blah, blah, blah. And that's why I think that you'll see some reviews that say, you know, this hobbles game performance too much, and you'll see other reviews that say, no, these are basically fine for gaming. For reasonable GPU configurations, these are fine for gaming. If you're going for something really high-end, really high frame rate, maybe not. Esports titles, that's not really true, because esports titles, you know, they're running like 200-300 FPS. Okay, it's a little bit true with CSGO, but there's a lot going on. These CPUs aren't for everybody, but I think they're pretty darn good. Let's talk about off-label uses. Our Dr. Zaber machine or a home server, something like that, you would be hard-pressed to find a more awesome, low-power, efficient home server CPU than the 7600. The problem right now is that I haven't seen, laid my hands on a really good motherboard for that home server use case scenario. I want something that's verified ECC compatible. I've got some DDR5 ECC memory I can use for testing. I even have the Passmark ECC DDR tester, although that's DDR4, so that's not useful in this scenario, but I can formally test ECC, at least on DDR4. I would like something with a dual 2.5 gig, or maybe 5 or 2.5 plus 5 or 10 gig on board, something like that. That would be nice. Maybe something with IPMI. I know something like that is coming from the new Giga Enterprise spinoff, probably ASRock Rack, and other companies offering that in AM5. That would be great. Love to see that. It's homogeneous cores. Not going to be a problem for hypervisors, not going to be a problem for anything like that. Home off-label use is super great. The 7700 and the 7900, really, really powerful systems. You know, like home workstation, work from home, whatever. If you're a software developer and you're running Git and you're doing lots of virtual machines and you need 64 gigabytes of memory, maybe even 128, those would make a good platform for that. And I have a feeling that OEMs are going to snap up those and build nice little systems. Workgroup servers, workgroup server based around the 7700, I think we'll see a lot of those, just because the cost of that is so low versus, true server platforms, especially if we get the right motherboard pairing with the more PCIe slots than we see on desktop. So I think these CPUs open up a lot of potential for off-label uses, which is really nice. Of course, for gaming, everybody is really excited about the CES announcement, the X3D processors that I was kind of alluding to in our intro. Those are coming. Those are coming February 2023, according to the CES announcement. So that's right around the corner. Yeah, if you want to build the ultimate gaming machine, I can't wait. Can't wait to test those. I want this level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the level 1 forums. Let me know. Let me know what you think. All right, I'll see you there.